Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're looking into something pretty wild.
Yeah, definitely off the beaten path.
The idea of people just vanishing.
Poof, gone.
Exactly, like starting over new identities, the whole 9 yards. It's like a real-life disappearing act. And the source material for this deep dive is...
A podcast.
Yeah, but not just any podcast. It's this fast-paced, hilarious discussion on a Spanish language podcast. So get ready for some slang.
Definitely some local flavor.
And some seriously passionate opinions.
Oh, yeah. These hosts definitely don't hold back.
All right, so let's start with what might be the most famous example of this. The Johatsu in Japan.
Johatsu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It literally means evaporated people.
Wow.
And it refers to people who just disappear from their lives.
Yeah.
No trace, no forwarding address. It's wild.
So it's more than just running away.
Right. It's deliberate.
Yeah.
And there's this fascinating connection to Japanese culture, this intense pressure to conform and the shame associated with failure.
So in a society that values harmony and collective success, failure can be incredibly isolating. Like, it reflects poorly, not just on the individual, but on their families, their community.
It's like this pressure cooker almost.
Exactly.
And rather than face the music, some people choose to just vanish, wipe the slate clean.
Now, that pressure cooker analogy, that's where things get really interesting. When we look at the Dominican Republic's take on evaporating.
Okay, buckle up, because this is where the podcast gets hilarious. They're talking about disguises, fake identities, and even a charter service for people who want to disappear. Like, it's a business.
Sounds like a pretty good business model.
Right. They even had this whole bit about a guy who won a Japita, that's Dominican slang for an SUV in a contest, but he missed the call because he was too busy living his best evaporated life.
Wow. Committed to the bit.
Totally. So you've got this global concept of evaporating, but it takes on this distinctly local flavor.
The Dominican hosts infuse the conversation with their culture's humor and playfulness.
Right. But they also dig into the motivations and anxieties that might drive someone to disappear.
Like, what are the underlying reasons?
Exactly. They talk about escaping debt, toxic relationships, even just the boredom of everyday life.
Like, who hasn't fantasized about dropping everything and starting over somewhere new?
Right. It's that universal yearning for a fresh start.
That makes this topic so fascinating. The reasons for evaporating might differ, but that underlying desire for change, that's a common thread.
And speaking of escaping, the podcast doesn't just stay in the Dominican Republic. They take us on this whirlwind tour of other places where this phenomenon exists.
Like, where else?
Well, they talk about Argentina, which saw this huge influx of European evaporators after World War II.
Makes you think.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that this desire to disappear, to start from scratch, isn't limited to any one culture or time period. It's a human impulse.
Universal yearning.
Okay, so we've got the Japanese seeking to escape shame and the Dominicans bringing the laughs. But what about the practicalities? How do you actually vanish in today's world?
That's the million-dollar question. And believe me, the Dominican podcast doesn't shy away from the challenges.
I bet it gets complicated.
Oh, it does.
Well, let's dive into those challenges right after the break.
Welcome back. You know, it seems like this whole evaporating thing really struck a chord with a lot of you.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely got me thinking. And this Dominican podcast, they really get into the nitty-gritty of how someone might actually pull this off, especially in a culture where everybody knows your business.
That's a great point. The hosts make a big deal about how different evaporating is in a place like the Dominican Republic compared to, say, Japan. They even had this saying, a Dominican can't even go to the colmado without running into their cousin's neighbor's best friend.
Right, exactly. So, like, maintaining anonymity, which is key to this whole evaporating thing, it becomes a real challenge.
Almost impossible.
Right. They're joking that you'd need a disguise just to walk down the street.
Speaking of disguises, they get pretty creative with their suggestions.
Oh, yeah. They were full of ideas. Changing your hairstyle, adopting a new accent, even a full-on pre-evaporation makeover, like you're going undercover.
It's like method acting for your new life.
Right. You can't just show up in a new place and expect to vanish. You got to become somewhere else entirely.
And that's where the practical challenges come in. The hosts spend a good chunk of time talking about the logistics of disappearing in the digital age.
Which is tricky these days.
Extremely tricky.
It's like they're creating a step-by-step guide to going off the grid. Ditch your cell phone. Pay for everything in cash. Sever all ties to your digital footprint. Like stepping back in time.
You had to become a ghost.
Right. And they even joke about how even if you're trying to disappear, you still need cash to make it happen. Can't exactly evaporate if you can't afford a plane ticket.
True. You need resources to disappear.
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of choosing a destination. During their call-in segment, listeners were throwing out all sorts of ideas, from remote islands to bustling cities.
Everyone's got their fantasy escape route.
Totally. One caller was dead set on disappearing to Tristan da Cunha, which is apparently one of the most remote inhabited islands in the world. Talk about getting away from it all.
Wow, that's commitment.
Right. And then there was this woman who dreamed of reinventing herself in Turkey, even had her new name picked out. Eustakia.
Eustakia.
I know, right? New name, new life. A fresh start in a land far, far away. It's like stepping into a whole new character in the story of your life.
It makes you wonder, why do people evaporate? Is it about escaping something bad? Or is it about pursuing something good?
That's a great question. And the podcast definitely explores both sides. For some people, it's about escaping debt, bad relationships, a dead-end job. It's about getting out of a bad situation.
Makes sense.
But for others, it's about something deeper, a longing for something more, a chance to break free from the expectations and limitations they feel are holding them back.
That desire for change.
Exactly. And that's what makes this topic so compelling. It's not just about disappearing, it's about that human desire for reinvention, for a chance to write our own stories.
Even if those stories take unexpected detours.
Well, this deep dive has definitely taken me on an unexpected detour, and it's made me think about my own life in a whole new way. But before we get too lost in our own evaporation fantasies, we've got one more part to this episode.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Okay, so we've talked about the why and the how of evaporating, but now it's time to get to the heart of the matter. Is this whole disappearing act ultimately selfish?
Or is it a brave move toward freedom?
Right. The Dominican podcast we've been exploring tackles this question head on, and it gets pretty intense.
It's a big ethical dilemma for sure.
Yeah. On the one hand, you've got people looking for a fresh start, maybe escaping a really tough situation.
Right.
But on the other hand, their decision to just vanish, it can really hurt the people they leave behind.
The emotional fallout can be huge.
The podcast hosts use this term emotional orphans to describe those left behind families, friends, loved ones who are just left wondering.
Wow, powerful image.
It really is. It makes you think about the ripple effects of our choices, even those made with good intentions.
It's not just about the person who disappears.
Not at all. The hosts shared stories from listeners who had been affected by someone's evaporation.
People whose lives were turned upside down.
Exactly. A parent, a spouse, a sibling who just vanished, leaving them with unanswered questions and unresolved grief.
Heavy stuff.
It definitely adds another layer to the whole evaporating thing.
Makes you think twice.
Right. It's easy to romanticize starting over, but it's important to remember that our choices have consequences.
Definitely. But the podcast also explored the other side of the coin.
Which is?
The individual's right to self-determination. This idea that we have the right to choose our own path.
Freedom of choice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There was this one caller. He was thinking about evaporating himself, and he described it as an act of self-preservation, like he felt trapped.
Like there was no other way out.
Exactly. And he saw disappearing as his only option.
So then it becomes this question of where do you draw the line?
When does pursuing your own happiness start to hurt others?
It's a tough one.
Really tough. The podcast hosts, they acknowledged this struggle, and they seem to have a lot of empathy, especially for people escaping abusive relationships or dangerous situations.
Trying to protect themselves.
Right. They even talked about historical examples of evaporating,
Right.
like the Europeans who fled to Argentina after World War II.
To escape the war.
Exactly. In those cases, disappearing wasn't so much about personal freedom. It was about survival.
That's a good point. We can't always understand what leads someone to make such a huge decision.
It's not our place to judge.
And the hosts were clear. There's no easy answer. Every situation is different.
Right. It's always going to be a balancing act between individual needs and the impact on others.
But it seems like in the Dominican culture, there's this deep understanding of reinvention.
It's part of who they are.
Like, they get it,
Yeah.
even if they don't condone it in every situation.
They even joked about how Dominicans are practically hardwired to reinvent themselves.
Always looking for a new hustle, a new adventure.
Exactly. So you could say that evaporating is just taking that impulse to the extreme.
It makes you wonder, though, do we all have a bit of that evaporator spirit in us?
Maybe.
Not to the point of disappearing completely, but that desire for a fresh start, to break free from what's holding us back.
It's a universal feeling.
Yeah.
That yearning for change, for something more.